clock is ticking for Vladimir Putin, and time is almost up. President Trump has delivered what may be his final ultimatum to Russia. Reach a peace deal with Ukraine within 10 days or face economic consequences that could reshape global trade forever. We're talking about secondary sanctions so severe they could cut Russia off from its biggest oil buyers, China and India included. But here's what makes this different from every other diplomatic threat we've seen. Trump isn't just targeting Russia anymore. He's going after every country that does business with Moscow. And the deadline? August 8th. That's this Friday.
Now, tomorrow marks President Trump's self-imposed deadline, another deadline for Russia. An ultimatum of sorts: agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine or face what could be crippling new sanctions, the so-called secondary sanctions that would hit countries that buy Russian oil with a 100% tariff. The president's already slapped an additional 25% on India, which is a big purchaser of Russian energy, for the penalty as punishment for continuing to buy Russian oil and gas. And the president has also threatened that China could be next. Let's talk about this. Joining us right now is Sir William Browder.
The accelerated timeline represents a dramatic shift from Trump's original approach. What started as a 50-day window for negotiations has been compressed to just 10 days, driven by mounting frustration with Putin's continued invasion and the relentless bombing of Ukrainian cities. This isn't just diplomatic posturing. New sanctions have already been implemented on countries buying Russian oil, with India feeling the pressure just this morning. To understand the magnitude of what's happening, we need to rewind to July 14th, when Trump first announced his initial ultimatum. The president originally gave Russia until early September to reach a peace agreement with Ukraine. The threat was clear. If no deal was reached, the United States would impose 100% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. But something changed Trump's calculus dramatically. Multiple phone calls with Putin left the president increasingly frustrated. Trump described a pattern that became all too familiar.
They would like to meet with me, and I'll do whatever I can to stop the killing. So last month, they lost 14,000 people killed last month. Every week is 4,000 or 5,000 people. So I don't like long waits. I think it's a shame. And they're mostly soldiers. They're Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, and some people from the cities where, missiles are lobbed in and you'll lose 35, 40 people a night, which is terrible. But no, mostly it's soldiers, and you're talking about, on average, 20,000 a month. 20,000 people are dying a month. Young, generally young people, soldiers.
The human cost of this conflict has become impossible to ignore. 14,000 people were killed last month alone, with weekly deaths reaching 4,000 to 5,000. These aren't just statistics, they're mostly young soldiers from both Ukraine and Russia, plus civilians caught in missile strikes. The monthly toll averages 20,000 deaths, a staggering number that underscores the urgency of finding a resolution. Trump has made it clear he doesn't want long waits while this humanitarian catastrophe continues to unfold.
Went into effect this morning. They were named this morning another 25%. That gives them 50%. So it's not just pressure from the United States to come to the table. Vladimir Putin might be getting calls from some of the other superpowers in the world, the leaders of India, the leaders of China. Hey, cut this out because this war is now costing us a lot of money. And we know that Steve Witkoff, I've been told by a senior administration official in the West Wing a few minutes ago, Steve Witkoff was told by Vladimir Putin today in Moscow that Putin wants to meet with Trump. Trump was told that during his debrief with Witkoff, and then he got a bunch of European leaders on the phone with Volodymyr Zelensky today, who was on a battlefield visit. And President Trump communicated that this three-person meeting, Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, could take place as soon as next week. But these are the kind of things, a big summit like this, that typically a lot of planning would.
This frustration reached a boiling point during Trump's recent trip to Scotland. The president's optimism about ending the war has collided with the harsh reality of Putin's intransigence. Despite what Trump described as very productive talks, the pattern remains unchanged. Diplomatic progress followed immediately by renewed violence. This cycle of hope and disappointment has pushed Trump toward his current hardline stance, threatening crippling sanctions if Russia doesn't agree to a ceasefire. Standing alongside British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Trump made a stunning announcement. He was slashing his original timeline to just 10 or 12 days. The disappointment in President Putin was palpable. Russia and Ukraine had seemingly reached the brink of a deal multiple times, only to see it collapse. The math here is brutal for Russia and its trading partners. China and India are consistently the top purchasers of Russian oil, accounting for hundreds of billions in revenue that keeps Russia's war machine running. The idea that these countries could suddenly divert their massive oil needs to other markets in just 10 days is virtually impossible. But that's exactly the point. Trump's secondary sanctions aren't just about punishing Russia. They're about forcing a fundamental choice on every nation that does business with Moscow. Continue trading with Russia and face 100% tariffs on your goods entering the United States, or abandon one of your key energy suppliers overnight.
Was so frustrated that Vladimir Putin was not slowing down with his invasion of Ukraine, continuing to push forward on the front lines after he put a 50-day deadline. So instead, he gave them 10 days for a ceasefire or face very, very strict sanctions, and also have new sanctions on people that are buying stuff from Russia, like China and India. The sanctions on India went into effect this morning. They were named this morning, another 25%. That gives them 50%. So it's not just pressure from the United States to come to the table. Vladimir Putin might be getting calls from some of the other superpowers in the world, the leaders of India, the leaders of China. Hey, cut this out because this war is now costing us a lot of money. And we know that Steve Witkoff, I've been told by a senior administration official,
The scope of these potential sanctions represents a seismic shift in how economic warfare is conducted. The Trump administration's approach reveals a sophisticated dual strategy. While Steve Witkoff's meeting with Russian officials was described as highly productive, the White House is simultaneously moving forward with secondary sanctions on countries importing Russian oil. Tariffs on India have already taken effect, demonstrating that this isn't an empty threat. The administration is using multiple economic levers to pressure Russia while maintaining diplomatic dialogue, a carrot-and-stick approach designed to force Putin to the negotiating table. Traditional sanctions have targeted Russia directly, cutting off its access to Western financial systems and technology. But secondary sanctions take this a step further, essentially weaponizing America's massive consumer market against any country that refuses to isolate Russia economically. For China, this creates an impossible dilemma. Beijing has carefully maintained its support for Russia throughout the Ukraine conflict, seeing Moscow as a crucial partner in its broader competition with the United States. Chinese companies have continued buying Russian oil at discounted prices, helping to prop up Putin's war effort while benefiting from cheaper energy costs. Now Trump is forcing China to choose: continue supporting Russia and risk massive tariffs on the $500 billion worth of goods it exports to America annually, or abandon its strategic partnership with Moscow to preserve access to the world's largest consumer market. India faces a similar calculation. New Delhi has dramatically increased its purchases of Russian oil since the invasion of Ukraine began, taking advantage of steep discounts while maintaining its traditional policy of strategic autonomy. But 100% tariffs on Indian goods would devastate the country's crucial services exports and manufacturing sectors. The timing of Trump's ultimatum is particularly significant. His special envoy, Steve Witkoff, recently met with Putin in Moscow, a meeting that Russian officials described as very useful and constructive. But despite this diplomatic engagement, Trump appears convinced that Putin is not serious about ending the war. The president, who once praised Putin's diplomatic skills, now appears genuinely angry that his efforts to broker peace have been repeatedly undermined by continued Russian attacks.
So while the Trump administration, President Trump himself, is saying that this was a highly productive meeting, they're simultaneously, according to a White House official, going to be moving forward with these sanctions, these secondary sanctions on those who import Russian oil coming later this week. And simultaneously, just hours after the meeting occurred, the White House also put out an executive order saying that there would be additional tariffs on India as a result of their imports of Russian oil. So you have a dynamic here where there are multiple levers that the administration is looking to use to clearly pressure Russia to try and actually end this conflict. Those are tools in their toolkit that the Trump administration was not willing to use or really even discuss for the first few months of their administration. So this is a very different strategy from the Trump administration. But what will be interesting and very important to watch here, Omar, is when the rubber hits the road. The Trump administration, a White House official saying that those secondary sanctions are going to go into effect on Friday. We'll have to watch and see if they actually do. And those tariffs on India as a result of India importing Russian oil are set to go into effect in 21 days from now. So that
This personal sense of betrayal seems to be driving Trump's increasingly aggressive stance. The president's growing frustration with Putin's lack of movement on ending the Ukraine war has reached a breaking point. Trump has called Russian attacks disgusting and pivoted to a policy of providing U.S. weaponry to Ukraine through NATO allies. The threat of sanctions if Russia doesn't make progress by Friday represents more than just diplomatic pressure. It's a fundamental shift in approach from someone who initially believed he could end this conflict through personal diplomacy. The deeper strategic calculation at work here is clear. Trump understands that Russia's ability to continue its war in Ukraine depends heavily on oil revenues. By threatening secondary sanctions on Russia's biggest customers, he's targeting the economic lifeline that keeps Putin's military machine operational. The numbers tell the story. Russia has earned hundreds of billions of dollars from oil exports since invading Ukraine, with China and India accounting for the vast majority of these purchases. This revenue has allowed Moscow to maintain its military operations despite Western sanctions and continue producing weapons and ammunition. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been clear about the administration's thinking. It's sanctions on countries that are buying the oil from Russia. It's about tariffs on countries like India and China that are buying their oil. It really is going to dramatically impact the Russian economy. But implementing these sanctions won't be simple. The United States is currently in delicate trade negotiations with both China and India. Trump faces a deadline of August 12th to either extend the current tariff pause with China or see a 145% hike on Chinese goods. His Russia ultimatum could complicate these negotiations significantly. There's also the question of enforcement. How exactly will the United States verify which countries are buying Russian oil and in what quantities? The global energy market is complex, with oil often changing hands multiple times before reaching its final destination. Russian crude might be refined in one country and then sold to another, making it difficult to track the ultimate source.
Has grown increasingly frustrated with President Putin after a lack of movement on Russia's part to actually end the Ukraine war. He has called the continued Russian attacks on Ukraine disgusting. He has said that his conversations with Putin have proved to be meaningless. And so earlier this month, he took that action to back a new move to get U.S. weaponry to Ukraine that would be paid for by NATO allies. That was a significant policy pivot for the Trump administration. And then we heard from President Trump that there would be sanctions on Putin, on Russia, if there wasn't actually movement to end the war. And so that deadline is looming. It's on Friday. President Trump said that this meeting between Steve Witkoff and Putin would determine whether or not those sanctions went into place. Of course, we would be looking particularly at the sanctions that he said would be on countries who are importing Russian oil, India and China being the major players there. I spoke with administration officials this week who said that there are moves to draw up those sanctions, to actually put them into place if President Trump decides that that is the direction he is going to go. However, they also say that it is highly likely that he could opt out of doing that if the Russians offer some substantive move here, potentially a ceasefire or something that could actually draw an end to the conflict, though over the course of the last few months we have seen no such movements on Russia's behalf. So we'll have to watch and see what Trump does when they get the readout of this meeting.
Putin's response to Trump's threats has been characteristically defiant. In a surprising development, Putin has expressed interest in meeting with President Trump to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. This request came during Steve Witkoff's meeting in Moscow, and Trump was subsequently briefed on Putin's proposal. the president immediately reached out to European leaders and Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss a potential three-way summit that could happen as soon as next week. White House officials have been careful to emphasize that it was Putin who requested this meeting, not the other way around, signaling that the pressure may finally be having an effect. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev dismissed the ultimatum as theatrical, claiming that Russia didn't care. But behind this public bravado, there are signs that Moscow is taking the threat seriously. Russian officials have been working to diversify their payment systems and reduce dependence on dollar-denominated transactions. The Kremlin has also been strengthening ties with countries like Iran and North Korea, seeking alternative sources of weapons and technology that don't depend on Chinese or Indian cooperation. For Ukraine, Trump's evolving stance represents both hope and uncertainty. President Volodymyr Zelensky has welcomed Trump's threats against Russia, posting on social media that Ukraine is ready for all honest and effective steps toward peace. But Ukrainian officials are also concerned about what concessions they might be expected to make if negotiations do begin. The broader implications of Trump's ultimatum extend far beyond the Russia-Ukraine conflict. If successful, secondary sanctions could become a new template for economic coercion, fundamentally changing how great powers compete in the 21st century. China, in particular, would face a precedent that could be applied to other areas of disagreement with the United States. If Trump can force Beijing to choose between Russia and American markets over Ukraine, what's to stop future administrations from making similar demands over Taiwan, trade practices, or human rights issues? This is why Beijing's response to Trump's ultimatum will be closely watched around the world. China's decision could signal whether it's willing to sacrifice economic interests for strategic partnerships, or whether it will prioritize access to American consumers over solidarity with Russia. The European Union is watching these developments with particular interest. European leaders have generally supported stronger sanctions on Russia, but they've been frustrated by the continued flow of Russian oil to Asian markets. Trump's secondary sanctions could accomplish what European diplomacy has failed to achieve, genuinely isolating Russia's energy sector. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz praised Trump's weapons announcement for Ukraine, calling it an important initiative. But European officials are also concerned about the precedent of using economic coercion on such a massive scale. If the United States can force countries to choose between Russian and American markets, it raises questions about European economic sovereignty as well. As August 8th approaches, all eyes are on Putin's next move. The Russian leader has shown remarkable resilience in the face of previous sanctions, finding ways to adapt and continue his war effort. But secondary sanctions represent a qualitatively different challenge, potentially cutting off the revenue streams that have sustained Russia's military operations. Putin faces several unpalatable options. He could attempt to call Trump's bluff, betting that the American president won't follow through on threats that could disrupt global energy markets and strain relationships with key allies. He could seek to accelerate peace negotiations, though this would require making concessions that he's previously rejected. Or he could double down on the war effort, hoping to achieve decisive military gains before the economic pressure becomes unbearable. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Trump follows through on his threats and China and India refuse to abandon Russian oil, we could see the most significant disruption to global trade since World War II. 100% tariffs on Chinese and Indian goods would immediately raise prices for American consumers while potentially triggering a global recession. But if the threats work, if major economies choose American markets over Russian energy, it could mark the beginning of the end for Putin's war in Ukraine. Without the revenue from oil exports, Russia would struggle to maintain its military operations and replace the equipment it's lost in nearly 3 years of fighting. There's also the possibility of a middle path. Countries like India and China might reduce their Russian oil purchases without eliminating them entirely, hoping to demonstrate good faith while preserving some energy security. Trump would then face the difficult decision of whether partial compliance is sufficient or whether he needs to follow through on his maximum pressure campaign. Congress is watching these developments closely. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal have introduced legislation that would give the president the authority to impose tariffs of up to 500% on countries doing business with Russia. Graham has called these potential sanctions a sledgehammer that could force all parties to the negotiating table. The domestic, political, Implications are significant as well. Trump campaigned on a promise to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours, a timeline that has proven impossible to meet. His shift toward a more confrontational approach with Russia represents both an acknowledgement of this failure and an attempt to demonstrate resolve in the face of Putin's intransigence. For American businesses, the uncertainty is becoming unbearable. Companies with supply chains that depend on Chinese or Indian goods are scrambling to understand what Friday's deadline might mean for their operations. The threat of 100% tariffs could force immediate restructuring of global production networks that have been decades in the making. The energy markets are already showing signs of stress. Oil prices have been volatile as traders try to price in the possibility of major disruptions to Russian exports. If secondary sanctions do take effect, the resulting supply shock could push energy prices significantly higher, potentially triggering inflation concerns that the Federal Reserve has been working to contain. As we approach Friday's deadline, the world is holding its breath. Putin's response in the next few days will determine whether Trump's gamble pays off or whether we're about to witness an unprecedented escalation in economic warfare. What makes this moment so dangerous is that both leaders have painted themselves into corners. Trump has staked his credibility on forcing Putin to negotiate, while Putin has built his domestic legitimacy on defying Western pressure. Neither can afford to be seen as backing down, which raises the stakes for everyone involved. The next 48 hours will likely determine the course of the Ukraine war, the future of global trade relationships, and the effectiveness of economic coercion as a tool of statecraft. If Trump's ultimatum succeeds, it could usher in a new era of American economic dominance. If it fails, it could accelerate the formation of alternative economic blocs designed to resist American pressure. One thing is certain, August 8th will be remembered as a pivotal moment in 21st century geopolitics. The decisions made in Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, and Washington over the next few days will shape international relations for years to come. For Putin, the clock isn't just ticking, it's about to run out. And for the first time since the Ukraine war began, the Russian leader may finally be facing consequences he can't simply ignore or work around. The question now is whether he'll blink first or whether Trump's most ambitious gamble will explode in spectacular fashion. Either way, we're about to find out just how far economic warfare can go in the modern world, and whether the threat of being cut off from American markets is powerful enough to end Europe's biggest war since 1945.